The past few years have been pretty good for video game remakes. They've become a good way to freshen up older games and present them to a modern audience. And it seems just about every big presentation nowadays has at least 2 or 3 new ones to bring to the table. But recently, I've noticed a weird stigma surrounding them that's been rubbing me the wrong way. I've seen a lot of people start to write off any and all criticism of the higher profile remakes as just nostalgia bias, and that any changes to these remakes don't really matter since the original game will always be there. In a way, I get where they're coming from, and in a broader sense, what they're saying is true, but in a way, I feel like that this mindset is missing the bigger picture. Most, if not all of these remakes make changes that end up altering the original experience. It's easy to look at ones like the Resident Evil 4 and Final Fantasy VII remakes on their own merits, since they're closer to full reimaginings that have new gameplay styles and directions. But it's when you get to those remakes that closely follow their original games when things start to get a little sketchy. While these aren't really one-to-one remakes, since they usually have their fair share of changes and updates, for the sake of simplicity, I'm going to keep referring to them as such. Video games nowadays are seen as an art form, and while I'd like to say that games can stand side by side to their remakes as equals, the reality is a lot of times they end up being seen as substitutes or replacements for their originals. Whether they're intended to be seen that way or not, I think a lot of times consumers will look at the shiny, newer version of a game and treat it as a substitute for the original experience. While this isn't inherently a bad thing, I do think it's important to highlight how well these one-to-one remakes capture their original experience. As much as I hate to admit it, I don't think a true one-to-one remake really exists. While there are remakes that get extremely close to their original counterparts, in the process of remaking a game for a modern audience, you're inherently going to have to change certain things in the process in order to appeal to that new demographic. All of these small and seemingly insignificant changes eventually add up, and result in a different experience to what you would have gotten in the original game. The amount of variance depends on the remake, but adapting these games in a more modern sense is going to end up changing the baseline experience, sometimes for better and sometimes for worse. This isn't a phenomenon exclusive to recent remakes either, as you can see it in some of the earliest examples of what we consider a remake nowadays. For example, look at Super Mario All-Stars for the Super Nintendo. Super Mario All-Stars is probably one of the oldest examples of a touched-up re-release. It's a collection of the original NES 2D Mario games, from the original Super Mario Bros. All the way to Super Mario Bros. 3, or up to World if you got a later version of the game. Not only does this game feature updated graphics and music, but it also has different physics from their original NES counterparts. I think this game is a prime example of remakes being used as a substitute for their original versions. Back in the day, you didn't have the various options to play older games the way we do now. Backwards compatibility becoming a thing was still a ways off, so you either kept the older system and its games, or you got rid of them for whatever reason and couldn't play those games anymore. This All-Stars collection lets you play those older games you liked on the newer hardware, but due to different graphics and physics, you won't get the exact same experience you would if you played the NES original. Another example of this kind of remake is for the original Resident Evil. While the game itself is mostly the same, the graphics have seen a massive overhaul, taking a much more gritty, realistic approach with its art style and environments. The voice acting was also redone to make it feel less campy than the original. Because of these changes, the remake takes itself a lot more seriously than the original, leading to a drastically different experience across both versions of the game. Wind Waker HD is a remake of the classic GameCube game for the Wii U. This version features new gyro controls for aiming, new items, Miiverse integrations, and most notably adjustments to the Triforce quest near the end of the game to make it less tedious. The World Ends With You Final Remix is a remake of the original DS game for the Nintendo Switch, that takes a battle system that was originally split between 2 screens and adjusts it to work on 1 screen, while updating the sprite work and music and adding some additional story content. Kingdom Hearts Rechain of Memories takes the 2D GBA game and adapts it into 3D, while adding new music, cutscenes with voice acting, and adjusting the gameplay to work better in a 3D space.
Come on!
The Crash and Spyro trilogy give the original PS1 games a fresh coat of paint with modern graphics, redone music and voice acting, and standardized physics across each entry. Are you starting to see the pattern yet?
PlayStation rules!
A lot of these kinds of remakes add to or adjust key components of their original games. While some are closer to their originals than others, they all in some way alter the experience you'd get from playing them over their originals, which isn't inherently a bad thing. A good handful of these remakes are actually my preferred way to play these games nowadays, But whether these remakes make good or bad changes, I still think it's important to highlight those changes and discuss how they either add or take away from the original experience. I think this is especially important because with all the games I just highlighted, they were the only way to experience said games on modern hardware at the time they were released. And in some cases they still are. You couldn't play the original Mario games on the Super Nintendo because its cartridges don't work on it. The only way you can play the original PS1 version of Resident Evil is through Sony's premium PlayStation Plus tier, and even then it's the Director's Cut version that made its own changes to the experience. The Wii U can't play GameCube games natively, so stuff like Wind Waker is out of the question. You get the idea at this point. Because the older versions of these games aren't as readily available, a lot of people's only option is to play the newer versions if they want to experience these games. While yes, stuff like third-party emulation is an option, that's ignoring the large portion of gamers that either can't or won't emulate for a variety of reasons. Plus, emulating certain games like The World Ends With You is really difficult, if not downright impossible, due to how those games control. So while some changes are going to be necessary when remaking these games, because they are often treated as substitutes for their originals, whether through necessity or convenience, it's equally as important to discuss how those changes either add or take away from the intended experience. So why then, when people do try to have a conversation about these changes, they're immediately shot down and told they're nostalgia-blind purists or against accessibility in gaming, among other really rude things that only work to distract from the conversation. A lot of people even go far as to say that the remake versions are always objectively better than the originals. It's as if the newer, shinier versions are immune to criticism just because it's the most up-to-date version of a game. To highlight this phenomenon, I've chosen two recent remakes that have both sparked discourse surrounding changes they've made in each of them, starting with a remake that I was really looking forward to when it was released. The original Persona 3 is a game that I've had a rough history with. I first played the game right off the heels of finishing Personas 4 and 5, and at the time I had a hard time wrapping my head around the tactic system and the AI party members. It was different from any turn-based RPG I had played up to that point, and I found the game to be way more frustrating than it was worth. I was dying a lot, so it felt like I was bashing my head against a wall over and over again trying to make progress in this game. I still beat the game because I was enamored with its story and characters, but the gameplay itself left a bad taste in my mouth for the longest time. As time went on though, I started to look back on my time with the game more fondly, and as I learned more about the ins and outs of its systems, I eventually came to genuinely enjoy just about every aspect this game has to offer. The original Persona 3 has a battle system that's really unique as far as RPGs go. While most RPGs are more reactionary in their battle structure, Persona 3's tactics system makes you plan your moves a couple steps ahead, kinda like you're setting up a chain of dominoes or something. This seemingly small change makes a big difference in how you approach both dungeon crawling and battles. So while I still enjoy traditional battle systems a little bit more, I've really came to appreciate what Persona 3 tries to do, rather than hate it for what it doesn't. Is it perfect? Fuck no, but in a way that imperfection lends itself to the game's themes in a really interesting way. It's become one of the most unique gaming experiences I've ever had, and I often find myself looking back fondly at my time with the game despite that rough first impression. Because of this, I was pretty excited when Persona 3 Reload was announced last year. The original Persona 3 can show its age in a few places, so a remake that smooths out those edges and makes the game available on modern hardware sounded like a dream come true. I was never really in the camp of Persona 3 needing a definitive version, if you will, but that doesn't mean I can't see the appeal in such a prospect. This game has been remade a few times already, with vastly different changes to each version, and since just one of these games can be like 60 hours on the low end, I can see merit in wanting one version that has the best aspects of all of them, while cutting out some of their lesser qualities. Unfortunately though, I find Persona 3 Reload to be lacking in capturing any version of Persona 3. That's not to say the game is outright bad, I did enjoy most of my time with it, but I find it made a lot of changes that kind of spit in the face of what the original game tried to do. The daily life stuff has seen some really nice improvements. As someone who likes to try and do as much as possible in one playthrough, I really appreciate the addition of the rewind system. It makes going for all the social links in one playthrough feel a little less overbearing, since if you feel like you wasted a day, you can just do it over without having to reload a save every 5 minutes. Giving all of the social links full voice acting was also a really good touch. It makes it easier to connect with the characters and get a better read on their struggles, since you can now hear exactly what tone each scene is going for. There's some small stuff with the scene direction and script writing that irks me, but overall the social life stuff was transferred over pretty well if you ask me, and a lot of the characters greatly benefit from the changes made in Reload. Unfortunately though, I find the dungeon crawling stuff, the actual game part, has seen a pretty massive downgrade. As I mentioned before, Persona 3 has a really unique combat system compared to the rest of the series, and while I was expecting them to prioritize direct party controls, I wasn't expecting them to completely neuter the AI party options in the process. The AI party members in Reload are dumb as rocks. They had been getting toned down with each subsequent release since Persona 3, but this is easily their worst implementation by far. The whole system is lacking the nuance it had in the original Persona 3. In that game, there were a handful of tactics options you could choose to more accurately direct your party. Here, not only are you limited to only like 3 different tactics options, but they also just straight up can't use some of the game's mechanics, like turn shifting for example. While it's still possible to beat the game with just the tactics, you're severely nerfing yourself just by using them. Normally I wouldn't really care since I mostly use direct commands anyway, but the tactics system is probably the defining feature of Persona 3's gameplay identity. So to see them not even put in the effort to preserve it in any way, even as an optional thing, is really disheartening. And unfortunately, it's not the only instance of things like this occurring in this remake. Instead of updating Persona 3's mechanics and giving them more of a modern twist, more often than not they just straight up remove them in favor of something worse. Something I really miss from the original game is the multiple weapon types. In that game, the protagonist could equip pretty much any weapon type in the game, all of which have different accuracies, power values, and other attributes. I really like this mechanic because it not only added another layer to strategizing, but it also added more freedom in the player expression. Plus I think it's just cool to be able to switch it up every once in a while and use a different weapon. Here though, it's just gone. The protagonist can only use a one-handed sword. They didn't add a similar mechanic to replace it or anything, it's just removed outright. Which sucks because it removes what could have been a really cool strategic option. The game is also stupid easy now. Like, I played the game on the hardest difficulty setting, and I still ended up dealing literally thousands of damage in battles and one-shotting bosses about halfway through the game. I think my biggest issue with the game is that it feels too similar to Persona 5. Just about every new mechanic that was added in this game is lifted from Persona 5 Royal. Stuff like Baton Pass and the new Theurgies, which are basically Showtime attacks. Now don't get me wrong, I love Persona 5. It's literally my favorite game ever made. More on that in this video. But Persona 3's gameplay mechanics were super unique even in the context of the rest of the series. So stripping those away and just turning the game into Persona 5 with a Persona 3 paint job is really lame. It's because of this that I can't really recommend this version of Persona 3 as a remake. Even just looking at it as a remake of the original game, I think it fails in a lot more areas than it succeeds. In a vacuum, the game is great, but I don't like the idea that this version that strips the original game of a lot of what made it unique in the first place is going to be the way most people are going to experience the game going forward. The original Persona 3 can be rough at times, but there's this intentionality behind the experience that lends itself into the game's themes beautifully. The multiple weapon types, for example, change how you approach battles and ambush enemies in the field, since they all have different ranges and attack speeds you have to consider. Being able to see the entire turn order before you attack allows you to better plan out your moves in advance and adjust the AI settings accordingly. The fatigue system, while annoying at first, helps ease you into Tartarus since you can't spend an awful lot of time in there in the early game. And it makes you experiment with different party combinations that you can still explore even if part of your team is worn out. You slowly start to gain new tactics options as you progress through the game, showcasing how the Siege members are becoming closer to one another and giving you that little smidge of extra choice in battle. It's stuff like this that helps intertwine the gameplay with the game's themes, and it makes it feel more nuanced as a result. Are these mechanics perfect? No, not really, but I feel that a lot of that intentionality is lost in Reload, since they decided to just outright remove all of these interlocking mechanics instead of adjusting them to a more modern lens and improving upon them. Now instead of planning out your moves in advance and choosing equipment to best suit the situation, you just slap on whatever has the highest stats and go into battle and spam Theurgies to win in 3 seconds. I rarely had to think about what I was doing, and it's nowhere near as satisfying as it was in the original game. I think it stings just a little bit more since this is like the 3rd time they've redone Persona 3. This is probably our last chance at getting an updated version of the game, and it's disappointing that to make this more accessible version, they had to remove almost everything that made the original version special in the first place and neuter the game's difficulty in the process. I guess it worked though, as I've seen a lot of people praise Reload for being more approachable than the original game. But I hate the idea that to make a remake more accessible to a modern audience, you need to remove any sense of nuance and difficulty the original game once had. It's a trend I've noticed with a lot of games, not just Reload, but the moment you try to talk about how new mechanics break the game, people will just say, well, if you don't like X mechanic, then just don't use it. But like, if mechanics added to a remake are better off ignored to make the game more engaging, then why bother adding them in the first place? Why should it be on me to balance the game for the developer if the people getting paid to work on it can't even balance it correctly on what's supposed to be the hardest difficulty setting? Difficulty is a touchy subject in general, but I've noticed that when a remake adds stuff like this that makes a game substantially easier, it's praised as a win for accessibility. Last I checked, accessibility was supposed to be for stuff like adding options and modifiers to help people with disabilities have an easier time playing your game, not removing any potential nuance or interesting mechanical depth the game could have had for everyone playing it. I saw these conversations a lot with Persona 3 Reload, but I also saw them surrounding another remake that came out recently. I was cautiously optimistic about the Thousand Year Door remake before it released. Not that I doubted Nintendo would make a bad product, but I haven't really been a fan of the direction the newer Paper Mario games have gone in, so I was worried that they would retroactively change things to make it more in line with those games. But thankfully my fears were unfounded. This remake is awesome. While playing it, I was reminded just why I loved the original so much. The script is just as funny as I remember it, and they even uncensored a bunch of stuff this time around, namely the stuff surrounding Vivian. The new soundtrack is a little hit or miss for me personally. Not that it's bad, I just think some of the tracks are a little too busy for my liking, and the new art style is pretty good too, aside from some really shiny floors for some reason. I was initially worried about the change in frame rate from 60 FPS to 30, but thankfully it's masked by the change in art direction, so the game still looks really nice. I love just about everything in this remake, but there's one small change they made that really bugs me. The Pit of 100 Trials is an optional challenge area that can be accessed throughout most of the game. As the name suggests, it's a series of 100 battles that you partake in as you descend the pit, with each subsequent level getting harder and harder. There's a lot of really tough fights down here, and even a special super boss at the lowest level, so the challenge not only comes from defeating all the enemies, but through item and badge management while exploring. If you die, it's game over, and you have to start all the way back up at the top. Unless you're playing the remake, that is. In the remake, when you die, you're given an option to restart on the floor you died on, which I think is kinda lame. A lot of people seem to disagree though, most justifying it by pointing out that there's an option to reload your save instead of retrying, so if you wanted the original challenge, you could still get it that way. While this point is technically true, I think it's missing the underlying issue. This is supposed to be a late to post-game challenge area, so I'm of the opinion that any change that makes it easier, optional or not, kinda defeats the purpose of the challenge in the first place. It's not like I'm against a retry button in games. In fact, I think the way it's implemented across the rest of the game to be quite tasteful. Instead of dying to a boss and having to reload a save, walk back to the boss, skip through the dialogue every time you die, you can just restart the boss right then and there. It's an example of a good quality of life change, it just saves you time backtracking to the boss. The argument for the option being in the Pit of 100 Trials is that, well, it just saves you time doing all the stuff you just did all over again. But I think there's a key difference between these two scenarios. For the boss fights, for example, the only thing the retry button lets you skip is the walk to the boss. It doesn't make the act of fighting the boss any more or less difficult if you use it. In the Pit of 100 Trials though, a key part of the challenge comes from doing the whole thing in one go. Defeating 100 enemies isn't the hard part, it's doing that while managing your health and item consumption with no other ways to heal. It's a test of your game knowledge, ability to perform action commands, and preparation. Adding a retry button inherently takes away from part of that challenge. Instead of what was once a test of your skill and resourcefulness is now effectively a war of attrition. I think it's also worth pointing out the psychological effect this has on the player. If you give someone an easier way out of a challenge, 99% of the time they're going to take it, even if it's optional, meaning they lose out on what could have been a fulfilling or interesting challenge had the game forced them to do it in one go. Limitations and challenges are intended to be a motivator. They're supposed to push you to get better at the game and in a lot of cases, make the experience more fulfilling. It seems nowadays that a lot of people are against any kind of resistance in a game, even though a lot of times that resistance is an intentional part of the game design. Take Dark Souls for example. That game's entire appeal is built off how difficult its bosses are, because it makes it more satisfying to beat them when you have to struggle against them and learn their patterns to stand a chance. While Dark Souls might be an extreme comparison to a game like Paper Mario, I think it still embodies the main point. Challenge exists to make you engage with the game's systems, so I don't understand why so many people are against anything that requires you to think even a little bit. It's not like Paper Mario is a difficult game to begin with, so I don't understand the pushback against leaving this optional challenge as is for those who want just a little more out of the game's systems. And no, I don't think the game being intended for a younger audience is a good excuse for removing any sense of difficulty. Need I remind you that the original game without the retry button is also intended for younger audiences? Kids are a lot smarter than people give them credit for, and challenging them is a good way to motivate them to learn and experiment with the game. I know I spent countless hours on hard games as a kid, mostly because I was bad at video games, but also because I enjoyed learning more about the game each time I failed. It made that eventual victory all the more satisfying. It's why games like Crash and even traditional Mario games are considered classics even today. Even though they're intended for a younger audience, they aren't afraid to challenge their players and push them to fully interact with the game's systems, not baby them and allow them to breeze through a game with no resistance. I think it's why here and here alone, the retry button takes away from the experience. It doesn't ruin the game or anything, but I do think it's a small blemish on an otherwise solid remake. I chose to highlight these two remakes in particular because the changes they made caused a lot of mean-spirited debates within their communities. Whenever someone mentions that they don't like a change one of these remakes made, they get harassed for it, called grifters, or told to off themselves, just because they decided to express how they didn't like a certain thing about a video game. For Paper Mario in particular, people bullied a creator so hard that he had to private his account to get it to stop. Like, what the hell, man? Even if you prefer the change, there's no reason to go after someone as viciously as these people were. My heart goes out to you, King K. You didn't deserve that shit. No matter what your stances on these changes are, there is absolutely no reason whatsoever to harass somebody for expressing their opinion about a video game. I noticed that a lot of the people dogpiling on takes like these are people that haven't even played the original games to begin with. I'm not saying you have to play both games to critique them or something, or that you can't prefer a change or remake made, but it's another thing to send hate to someone over their opinion on a remake when you haven't even played the game in question. It's like they feel the need to defend the remake because it's their version of the game or something. It kinda proves my point that one-to-one remakes like this are often used as a substitute for the original versions. Whether that's because the remake is the only way to play them, or because someone just prefers to play the newer one, this is why it's important to highlight changes like this, to show if or how something is lost in the process of implementing that change. In a way, these two remakes are opposite sides of the same coin. Persona 3 Reload is a lackluster remake that takes a lot of what made the original game stand out, and removes it to be more in line with the franchise's modern standards. While Paper Mario is an otherwise faithful remake that makes one small change to an optional challenge that, in some people's eyes, hurts the challenge overall. Both remakes make changes that alter the way parts of the games are experienced. And while that's not always a bad thing, people should still be able to talk about these changes without the fear of being eviscerated for daring to speak their mind. If you prefer these changes, that's valid, and I'm happy for you. But at the same time, it's also valid for someone to not like those changes and to express that opinion. It's also possible to like a remake as a whole, but dislike specific changes it makes. People value different things in games, so as long as people are trying to have a civil discussion, an opinion shouldn't be written off for simply being different than yours. I didn't make this video to shit all over remakes and say that the original is always better or something. In fact, there's a lot of cases where I'd rather play the remake over the original for a variety of reasons. What I wanted to highlight was this weird double standard when it comes to viewing video game remakes critically. Remakes exist in this weird middle ground, where people try to view them on their own merits while also being based off a pre-existing work, when oftentimes those two viewpoints conflict with each other. I don't think it's entirely possible to separate a remake from its original source. It's a remake of an already existing product, and as much as I'd like to say both products can stand on their own, at the end of the day, whether because they don't have any other choice or just prefer the shinier version, a large subset of people buying these remakes are doing so as a substitute for playing the original version. Because of that, I think there is merit in talking about just how well a remake captures the original vision, both where it succeeds and where it fails on that front. Being a bad remake doesn't necessarily make it a bad game, but it can hurt someone's enjoyment of said remake if they already have some experience with the original. That's not to say changes can't and shouldn't be made, but they shouldn't conflict with the core experience of the original game. Any changes made to these remakes should be in service of elevating the original experience, not fundamentally changing it into a different one altogether. People like to defend changes like this that alter the game experience as expressions of video games as an art form. Just because it's not like the original game, it's still valuable as its own piece of art. But then what about the people that worked on those original games? Should their vision be discarded just because the newer people working on the remake think that vision is outdated? What about their artistic intention? Does it not matter as much because that product is already out? Not every change in a remake is going to be as severe as others, but I think the goal should be preserving as much of the original piece of art as possible, even if that means some of the clunkier aspects go unchanged. Obviously, it's not realistic to expect that everything about the original games will make it over to their remakes, and that gets even harder with games that have multiple remakes like Persona 3. But as long as the spirit of those original games is there, I think that's when remakes are at their best. Especially if we aren't going to go out of our way to make sure the original games are available on modern hardware alongside every game that gets remade, which for a variety of reasons can be impossible depending on the game. Capturing what made the original so special to begin with should be top priority. When a remake can do both its own thing while also respecting the intentions of the original game, that's a sign of a good remake. It's why games like Resident Evil 4 can stand next to its original without feeling out of place, despite having a drastically different gameplay style. If a remake has to get rid of everything that made a game special in the first place in pursuit of modernization, can you really even call it a remake at that point? It's okay to like a remake in spite of the changes they make, just as much as it's okay to not like a remake for the same reasons. But I think regardless of which camp you fall into, we should try to be more respectful towards the original works and each other while talking about these remakes. Remakes are a great way to give these old games that aren't as easily accessible, whether through availability or archaic design, another time in the spotlight. They should be treated as a celebration of their legacy, polishing them up a bit while keeping that core intact. Someone disliking aspects of a remake doesn't make them a bad person, or a grifter, or a contrarian, or whatever you want to label them. And the same goes for people who do like them as well. At the end of the day, both sides are just people, so don't try to send them a bunch of hate just because they have a different opinion on a video game than you. Just be nice to each other for fuck's sake, it's not that hard.